Ears that once trembled beneath the scream of propellers still remember the roar of engines clawing at the ocean wind, the echo of metal birds returning home, some limping, some never making it back at all. They remember the way the deck pitched beneath their boots, the smell of salt and oil, the ghosts of friends who vanished into the gray Pacific horizon. If you listen closely, you can still hear that thunder, fading like an old heartbeat, each pulse carrying the memory of a war fought not only in the skies, but on the very decks that gave those skies their warriors. Back then, the ocean itself was a battlefield, and the aircraft carrier, floating, creaking, trembling with life, was both sword and sanctuary. Yet, for every plane that soared into the blue, another risked death in trying to return. In those days, landing on a carrier wasn't just a maneuver, it was a gamble. You could survive a dogfight, evade enemy flak, and still die trying to touch your own home deck. And before one man changed everything, before a single crazy idea rewrote the very rules of naval aviation, the sea demanded a price every single week. 80% fewer crashes. That number feels unbelievable now, almost a myth whispered between generations of pilots. But it's true, and it began with one man who refused to accept the inevitable. They called carrier landings controlled crashes for a reason. The decks were short, the winds unpredictable, the waves merciless. The ship could rise or fall 10 feet in a second, turning precision into chaos. Pilots trained to fight in the sky were forced to master a landing strip that moved like a living creature, and with each touchdown came disaster waiting on the edge of the propeller's spin. Tires shredded, hooks snapped, wings shattered against the barriers. Every week, the Navy lost men, not to enemy gunfire, but to the very decks they were trying to return to. The brass called it statistical loss, an acceptable price for progress. But for the men who flew, it wasn't numbers, it was names, it was friends. And for one pilot, it was a nightmare that wouldn't fade. He couldn't accept that homecoming should feel more dangerous than combat. In those early carrier days, training films spoke of faith and feel. There were no laser guides, no modern instruments, just instinct, luck, and whatever prayers could fit between the roar of the engine and the scream of the arresting wires. Pilots were told to trust their gut, but guts couldn't stop steel from tearing apart on impact. Something had to change. And in the middle of the chaos stood a man who wasn't willing to let tradition keep killing his own. His idea, when he first spoke it aloud, drew laughter, then anger. Too dangerous, they said, unrealistic, suicidal. But those same voices had watched more men die than they could count. And still, they refused to listen. That's when he decided to prove them wrong, not with theories, not with diagrams, but with flight. He began with observation, standing on deck during recoveries, watching how pilots came in, too high, too steep, too fast. He noticed something no one else had dared to question. The angle of approach wasn't just risky, it was blind. Pilots couldn't see the deck clearly until it was too late to adjust. That blindness, those few fatal seconds, were the difference between life and death. And so, he thought, what if the problem wasn't in the flying, but in the seeing? What if by changing how the pilot saw the deck, everything changed? It wasn't a question of courage. It was a question of perspective. He started small, just an idea scribbled on a notebook. A few sketches of sightlines, horizon points, and a strange new approach curve. He wasn't trying to invent new technology. He was trying to realign the human eye with survival itself. The Navy dismissed him, but curiosity, mixed with desperation, has a way of spreading quietly among men who have lost too many friends. Soon, whispers of his crazy method began circulating below deck. They say he can land without bouncing once. They say he approaches us from the side. They say it feels wrong until it feels perfect. But what could possibly make seasoned aviators call another man's technique crazy and genius in the same breath? That's where the story turns. Because the ocean, as always, wasn't done testing those who tried to defy it. Ears that once listened for the signal officer's paddle still echo with the words wave off. Wave off. The command that meant a pilot's heart would surge. His plane too misaligned, too fast, too off balance to risk a landing. Those two words could save his life, or end it if spoken too late. The pilot we speak of had heard them too many times. He knew the sound of panic in a young aviator's voice as the deck raced up to meet him. He knew the helplessness of watching a friend clip the stern and vanish in a fireball. Every instinct told him something deeper was wrong with the system itself. It wasn't the men. It wasn't even the planes. It was the way they were told to see the carrier. The Navy's doctrine demanded a straight-in approach, lined with the center of the ship, logical on paper, deadly in practice. From that angle, pilots lost sight of the deck just when they needed to see it most. The ship's bow would obscure the landing area, creating a blind zone right before touchdown. You couldn't correct what you couldn't see. That blindness was the killer. So this pilot dared to ask a question that every other flyer had accepted as law. What if the straight approach wasn't the safest way? What if, instead of flying directly toward the ship, a pilot came in at an angle, offset, sideways, watching the deck the entire time until the last second? It sounded insane, even suicidal, because in theory, that meant flying closer to the ship's side before swinging the plane into alignment just before landing, mere seconds from disaster. It broke every rule in the book, but he'd done the math. He'd run the numbers. He'd tested it in his mind and in the air. He wasn't gambling with arrogance. He was betting on observation. And in war, the difference between arrogance and innovation is measured in lives. When he first tried it, no one believed what they saw. From the flight deck, it looked like madness, a pilot approaching at a slant, his wingtips seemingly flirting with the ship's edge. The crew braced for impact. But then, a perfect catch. No bounce. No skid. The hook caught clean. The plane stopped right where it should. The man in the cockpit didn't even flinch. "Do it again," someone muttered. He did. And again, it worked. 3 flawless landings in a row. By the time word reached the tower, disbelief had turned into stunned silence. The senior officers watched him repeat the maneuver under different wind conditions. Same result. Same eerie precision. It wasn't luck. It was control. He'd found a new visual rhythm, an angle of sight where the human eye could track the deck continuously instead of losing it in that fatal blind spot. But tradition doesn't yield easily. The Navy's senior ranks weren't impressed. They were furious. "You'll get someone killed with that stunt," they warned. "We have procedures for a reason," he argued back, calm but relentless. "We're already losing them," he said. "Every week, every landing, every bad angle." He offered to demonstrate it officially. One mission, one chance. Command reluctantly agreed, partly to silence him. The test took place on a morning when the sea looked like hammered steel, the light cutting through the haze. He took off, circled, and came in at his new angle. The ship rolled 5 degrees just as he turned into alignment, a deadly timing for the old method. But this time, he never lost sight of the deck. The plane kissed the landing area, hook snapping the wire perfectly. The deck crew froze. They'd seen the impossible, a landing so smooth it looked rehearsed by fate itself. In the wardroom that night, voices rose. Some called it luck, others witchcraft, but a few, the ones who'd lost too many friends, leaned forward, their eyes lit with hope. One of them whispered, "If that works every time." And that whisper turned into an echo that traveled across carriers like a rumor of salvation. Pilots began to experiment, mimicking his angled approach, testing it in secret training sessions. The results spoke for themselves. Crash rates dropped almost overnight, by half, then more. Mechanics noticed fewer shattered undercarriages. Medics had fewer burn victims. Flight crews stopped bracing for the worst each time a plane came home. It wasn't long before word reached the top, an 80% reduction in landing accidents wherever this new method was practiced. Of course, the brass didn't like being proven wrong by one man's unauthorized deviation. Orders were issued. Official investigations began. But facts are stubborn things. And numbers, when they start saving lives, have a way of rewriting orders. His crazy method became impossible to ignore. The same admirals who once dismissed him began requesting demonstrations. Training manuals were quietly rewritten, diagrams adjusted. The doctrine evolved, not overnight, but inevitably. History, though, rarely remembers who started the change. That's the cruel truth of innovation in wartime. Ideas don't wear medals, and their creators often fade behind the noise of victory. But somewhere, in the storm of engines and salt, one man had altered the very rhythm of survival, and the sea, for once, seemed to respect him for it. Ears that once strained to hear the thud of an arresting wire now echo with a different rhythm, the steady, confident thump of landings that no longer ended in screams or smoke. For years, carrier decks had been haunted by chaos. But after one man's defiance took flight, something began to change. You could feel it in the way the crews stood a little taller on deck, how pilots no longer whispered prayers before touchdown. The deck had stopped being a graveyard of steel and flame. It had become, finally, a home. The method spread quietly at first, pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, like a secret too precious to keep hidden. They called it the angled approach, but to those who used it, it felt more like a gift, a way of finally seeing the deck as it truly was. With each successful landing, disbelief turned into trust, and trust turned into doctrine. In the early months, the numbers told a story no commander could deny. Where this technique was used, crashes dropped by over 80%, not by luck, not by weather, but by sheer human ingenuity, the kind that comes not from orders, but from necessity. For every 100 landings before, 10 would end in wreckage. Afterward, it was one, sometimes none. It was as though someone had turned down the volume on death itself. One squadron reported they hadn't lost a single pilot in over 6 weeks, a record unheard of in the Pacific theater. The maintenance crews noticed it too. Fewer crumpled propellers, fewer twisted fuselages, fewer letters sent home. The carrier decks that once trembled under fear now hummed with rhythm, predictable, precise, almost musical. There was a strange beauty in watching dozens of planes glide in, one after another, each hitting the wires as if drawn by fate. The chaos that once defined carrier aviation had been replaced by choreography, but success, as always, brought controversy. The official reports tried to downplay the change. The Navy didn't like crediting individuals. It preferred systems, committees, collective progress. The pilot's name barely appeared in the documents that followed. His technique became standardized, labeled under revised landing procedure, stripped of origin, stripped of story. But the men who flew knew. They told each other quietly in the ready rooms. You know who made this possible. Some even painted his initials under their cockpit canopies, small, hidden tributes that no officer could order removed. It was a brotherhood built not on glory, but on gratitude. There's one story that still circulates among old aviators. A night operation in rough seas. Visibility near zero. The deck lit only by thin amber lines of lamps. The ship heaved in the dark, its surface slick with salt and oil. A rookie pilot, making his first night carrier landing, lined up using the old straight-in method. He lost sight of the deck halfway through the approach. The flight controller shouted to wave off, but before he could pull up, another voice cut through the radio. Angle in. Don't look at the nose. Look at the deck. It was his commanding officer, one of the first who trained under the crazy method. The rookie adjusted, heart pounding, eyes locked on the horizon, bringing the ship back into view. He flared late, hit perfect center, caught the wire. The deck crew erupted in disbelief. Another life saved, not by luck, not by instinct, but by an idea born of rebellion. That night, the officer simply wrote in his logbook. He would have been gone without the new sightline. Nothing more. No grand statement, no victory speech, just acknowledgement. A quiet truth that the sea had claimed fewer souls that day. because one man, years before, had dared to see differently. It's strange how war, which thrives on destruction, sometimes births its greatest acts of preservation. How one person's refusal to accept failure can ripple outward and rewrite destiny. When people talk about innovations that won the war, they mention radar, codebreakers, jet engines. But what about this? What about a simple change in how a man looks at the world? A slight tilt, a small defiance that ends up saving thousands of lives. Sometimes, survival isn't born from technology or power, but from perspective. And perhaps that's why this story still feels unfinished, because it isn't just about flying, it's about vision, about having the courage to see what others refuse to see. Even years later, when the war ended and the Pacific fell silent, those who'd lived to tell the tale would say the same thing. It wasn't the battles that haunted me, it was the landings. And yet, thanks to one forgotten pilot, the fear that once owned those decks faded into memory. Every safe landing became a silent salute to him. But time, as it always does, buried the details beneath medals and headlines. And so, the man who changed carrier aviation forever became a ghost in his own legacy. Ears that once heard the ocean's fury now strained to remember the silence that followed. The soft hum of engines powering down, the sigh of wind through the rigging, the thud of boots across a deck no longer slick with oil and fear. For those who lived through those years, the sound of a clean carrier landing was more than a noise. It was survival set to rhythm. Decades later, those same ears might hear only the faint buzz of memory, the ghosts of engines that no longer fly, the laughter of men who no longer answer roll call. But somewhere deep down, in that space between memory and silence, there remains an echo, the echo of one man's defiance, the echo of a mind that refused to believe that death was the cost of doing things the way they've always been done. His idea didn't come from textbooks or laboratories. It came from the sky itself, from the chaos of the cockpit, from the instinct to protect, to preserve, to make it home. In time, his angled approach evolved into something greater, the modern mirror landing system that still guides carrier pilots today. Each time a jet approaches that floating strip of steel, every pilot lines up their vision, checks their glide path, and adjusts according to the very principles he once tested alone against the Pacific wind. They do it without knowing whose hands first drew that line, whose courage first bent the rules of survival. They do it because it works. Because one pilot, once called reckless, once mocked for seeing the world differently, taught the Navy how to trust sight again. He never became a household name. There were no parades, no statues, no songs. But there are thousands, tens of thousands, who owe their lives to his stubborn refusal to crash quietly. His invention didn't explode, didn't roar, didn't kill. It simply saved. And that's why history forgot him. War remembers its weapons before its wisdom, but wisdom has a way of outliving firepower. His crazy method, born of frustration and loss, became the foundation of every safe landing since. 80% fewer crashes, 80% more men who live to see home, to write letters, to have children, to grow old enough to forget the smell of burning fuel. That's a legacy no metal could match. Sometimes, when you stand on a modern carrier deck and feel the tremor of a jet landing perfectly, you can almost hear that old echo return, the hum of the past whispering beneath the roar of turbines. It says that innovation doesn't always come from authority. Sometimes it comes from defiance, from heartbreak, from one man refusing to watch another die because of tradition. Maybe if those ears, those same ears that once heard the ocean's rage, could still listen, they'd recognize the faint reflection of their own defiance in the skies above. Because every perfect landing, every safe return, every roar that fades into silence is proof that one mind, one crazy idea, can change the fate of thousands. And so, as the sun sets behind another carrier cutting through calm seas, and the ghosts of the past drift quietly on the wind, one question remains, unanswered, but eternal. Could the smallest shift in vision truly change the destiny of a war? Or perhaps the meaning of courage itself.